I would say the number one thing you probably will miss is the difference in timelines. So maybe unlike some of the distributors in the US, provinces set their own timelines on how you get a product listed in the market, but also pricing and promotions. So for example, today we're working on products that will come out in the market 9 to 12 months from today. So even if I would list a product today, it won't be in market until September 2026, which is a very long innovation schedule to be running, to be really honest. But that's the same for also programming. So if you have a product you want to run in market and you would like to run a limited time offer or a non-liquid value add in market, that's 9 months from today. So it's really about long-term planning to ensure your products are on the shelf at the time you want in the products and spaces you want across all the different provinces.
Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the US by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up 3 key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the US market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the US. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Although maybe today we should rename it Masterclass North American Wine Market, Masterclass Canadian Wine Market, because today I'm really thrilled to welcome Amy Liu to the show. So Amy is a senior brand manager at the Mark Anthony Group, which is one of the largest and most influential beverage companies in Canada. Their portfolio spans premium wine, spirits, and ready-to-drink brands, but the company really plays a major role in shaping consumer awareness, retail strategy, and category growth across the country. So with more than a decade of experience building premium brands, Amy brings some deep expertise in navigating the complex landscape and unlocking sustainable growth in a market as nuanced as Canada. Amy, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Absolutely. I'll let everyone in on a little secret that I know Amy because she and I are in the same MBA program together. And it's not a wine-focused MBA. So it's really exciting to have a fellow industry person to share.
I know. I was pretty surprised there was anybody else in wine. I thought I would be the only one. So it's really good that you're on today.
Wine people, we're everywhere. Well, before we dive into today's discussion, Amy, can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you came to work in the wine business?
Absolutely. I actually surprisingly started in the beer industry and also the spirit industry. So I worked for Miller Lite in the US. That was actually my first touch point into any bev alcohol. And I don't know if anyone else has worked in the beer industry. It's I found one of the most fun industries to work for. And I was pretty much hooked on bev alc from there on. When I was working for Absolut, I got a call from a recruiter and I wasn't even looking for a job. The recruiter essentially said, you have to meet Alex. She's building a new wine team. You're going to love her. I met her. And from there, I've worked on wine for the last 5 years. I've gotten both my WSET 2 and 3, and I've loved wine ever since.
Oh, amazing. Amazing. And you work with brands mostly from North America, or where are most of your wine brands from?
So I personally work mostly for North American brands, so Canadian brands as well as some in the US. But my team across the board, because we kind of have a dual business. We do a couple of brands that we own on our own, so White Claw, and we own 7 vineyards out in BC. But we also work with partners that work across the world, and we're helping them kind of distribute here in Canada. So in that part of the business, we work with so many brands. We work with US brands, Italian brands, French wines. So it's kind of a big mix across the board.
Amazing, amazing. And that's why we thought it was so important to talk to somebody from Canada. The focus of our show has always been the US market, but really there's so much potential in all of North America. And Canada really remains one of Italy's largest and most stable export destinations. So you told me earlier, Amy, that imported wine really represents the majority of Canadian consumption, and Italy is consistently ranking among the top for Canada's suppliers. So for Italian producers, this is a combination of definitely high import reliance market, but really strong existing market share that makes Canada very strategically important and very reliable when it comes to premium wine. So with that in mind, our 3 key takeaways for this episode and what we're excited to dive into with you, Amy, are first, Let's talk about Canada as a market, because like the US, it is not one wine market. It's a patchwork of provincial ecosystems that really reward strengths when Italy's strengths specifically too, when producers really tailor their approaches by province. Then number two, let's talk about the elephant in the room. So how has the removal of American wines from Canadian shelves created opportunity for Italian wineries? And then number three, we'll talk about the real growth opportunity, which is in building long-term brand equity through this system literacy. So knowing how to win inside the monopolies and how to support the trade partners and how to show consistent value without eroding any of this premium positioning. Okay.
Sounds good.
Exciting stuff. Let's dive right into it. So, like we said, Canada is very much similar to the US in that it is not one market, but very different in that it's provincial markets, it's monopolies for the most part. So, Amy, when you look at retail or these provincial patchworks like LCBO, like SAQ, like BCL, when you compare them side by side, what are some maybe kind of invisible rules or incentive structures that some producers often miss?
I would say the number one thing you probably will miss is the difference in timelines. So maybe unlike some of the distributors in the US, provinces set their own timelines on how you get a product listed in the market, but also pricing and promotions. So for example, today we're working on products that will come out in the market 9 to 12 months from today. So even if I would list a product today, it won't be in market until September 2026, which is a very long innovation schedule to be running, to be really honest. But that's the same for also programming. So if you have a product you want to run in market and you would like to run a limited time offer or a non-liquid value add in market, that's 9 months from today. So it's really about long-term planning to ensure your products are on the shelf at the time you want, in the products and spaces you want across all the different provinces. And the number two, that's probably the most frustrating, is the markup structures. So there is no standard markup structure across Canada. So the same product will get different margins across the board at different provinces. So if you have a high priced product, so an expensive bottle of Italian wine, Alberta by far will give you the most margin because it's a flat markup structure. So you will never pay a little bit more taxes, versus most other provinces have a varied markup structure, which then you might be priced the same on a retail scale across the board for everybody, but you're making very vastly different margins across the board. So when you're setting pricing in Canada, one of the observations is understanding where do you want it to be for a consumer, and are you able to sustain that price point across every single province?
And in your experience, what are producers doing in terms of their pricing structure? Like, how are they positioning maybe LCBO versus SAQ? Like, you just have to know what the tax rates are going to be and go from there, or?
Yeah, so really difficult kind of conversation to have, but there's actually like a pricing calculator they built every single year. So the other thing is there's taxes built in every year, it changes. So Canada's probably by far the one of the pricier places for you to buy alcohol. So same bottle of wine, I would assume in the US or even in Europe, it'll be a little bit cheaper because excise tax increase every single year here in Canada. So the floor pricing for every bottle of wine goes up every single year. But the way we generally price across the board is you want to try to keep retail pricing the same. LCBO is the largest buyer in the entire world for beverage alcohol, and part of buying with them in the contract that you sign is that they will get the best deal in Canada. And so historically, they've never actually taken up on that clause in their legal structure. 2 years ago, they did. And so a bunch of suppliers were slapped with fines because they did not price the same across the board. So if you're going to come into Canada, it's something really you have to consider, kind of how do you want to price across the board to ensure that you have the right price point for everybody, but also the right structure for yourself.
Yeah. And how important is it, do you think, that producers, suppliers are in multiple provinces at the same time?
I think that's a really interesting question. It depends on the scale of your brand, in my opinion. So if you are a new brand and you want to test out and you only have the budget to really fund one province, I think it's probably better for you to test it out in one province, build out a success story before you expand across various different provinces. Because of the nuances of the provinces, there are kind of different ways you could test it out. If you want a low cost, just to understand if the taste profile is going to work in Canada, Alberta or BC is a great market. Alberta is actually an open market in Canada, so we call them the Wild Wild West. Essentially, you can list any product you want and everybody can buy it from you. So there's really lax rules there, but because of that structure, distribution is extremely difficult. Tiny mom and pop shops, 2,000 different stores, there's convenience, there's grocery, there's big buyers. So for you to try out a product to see if Canada is even having the appetite for that product, probably an interesting way for you to test. But if you're trying to scale it in Canada, tough market to be in. On the other hand, I know monopoly gets a lot of bad names, but if you're testing and you're trying to scale a product in Canada, getting into the LCBO essentially guarantees you 40% of the population here in Canada. The distribution is essentially a non-conversation because it's one customer. And if you get into that one customer, you essentially have access to 650 stores if you could work out that deal with an LCBO. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for and what you're hoping to achieve out of that market launch. And then you would figure out what province you'd want to be in. I always suggest going one province at a time. Every province is very different, even the consumers that are in that province. Very similar to the US, I would say the West has a little bit more similar to California versus Alberta. They compare them to Texas a lot, or Toronto's vastly different, more similar to kind of the East Coast vibe. So if you're going to test out a product, I highly recommend trying one province, figuring out that structure before moving forward to other provinces.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think that's a really great call out that monopolies kind of get a bad rap, but there is some benefit. A bad rap maybe from the getting into the market perspective. But like you said, up front, sure, there's a lot of logistics, super long lead time, but then at the end of the day, you have this availability, this reach that is really people, kind of would kill to get their hands on, right?
Kind of similar to like Costco, if you were to imagine in a free market. So in
Yeah.
Alberta, we have Costco. You get into Costco, you're selling volume in a way that is very different than you kind of in an open market. You get exactly that in all of the monopoly markets, essentially. Now, don't get me wrong, I would say pitching is a lot more difficult because, again, one customer, subjective buyers, if they don't like
Yeah.
it, it's a tough sell. But if you get in, you have that one big shot to really get some volume for your brands.
And if you're a really small producer with maybe some more limited resources, is it a good idea for you to try to set your targets right away on something like LCBO? Or should you be, does it make more sense to target something like Alberta with less resources?
I would say depends on what type of resources. So one of the biggest challenge for getting into a big market like an LCBO or an SAQ is consistent supply, which I think is probably also a bigger challenge for a smaller supplier. So if you want to go after an LCBO, making sure you can consistently supply to the volume they need. And don't get me wrong, volatility in forecasting is a huge thing at the LCBO, especially this year. So that is number one. They actually give out a supply chain score, so an OTIF score. And so if you don't score high enough, you're prioritized lower on the buyer's list. And so that's probably number one is supply wise, are we feeling comfortable about that? And if we don't, then I highly recommend going somewhere else first, prove out, build out your capabilities before coming back. Because again, LCBO being a monopoly, it's kind of a one shot. So if you get to go in, it's amazing, but you don't want to miss that one shot. It'll be a lot harder to go back for a second buy if you didn't get a really good result from that first one.
Oh, that's really great advice. Thank you for sharing that. What about the role of category stewardship? So, how is that different from province to province? And how can wineries, Italian wineries especially, adapt their storytelling accordingly?
Absolutely. I would say, depending on how shops are set up, Canada is really specific, I would say. So if you go into a store, wine is generally speaking in two sections. You've got everyday affordable wine that's under $20, $25. Those are categorized by countries of origin, and sparkling versus still. Italy will be all with Italy. So your competitive set is essentially on the shelf. You can go in, you can know exactly who's there on the shelf. On the back of the store, there's a section called the vintages, or what they call kind of one-time buys. So those are special jewels that the LCBO picks every single year. They could be the same as the year before, it could be different. And so it really depends on, I can't remember your question now, I'm so sorry. I rambled and now I don't remember.
Don't worry, don't worry. So I was asking in terms of, the role of category stewardship, how does this differ from one province to another? And as such, how can a supplier adapt their storytelling accordingly?
Gotcha. Sorry, going back. Okay. Category stewardship. I would say depends on the province again. So provinces like LCBO or Ontario has category buyers, actually three category buyers for a category like Italy. So if you're going to tell a story for a category buyer that exclusively works on Italy, you really want to make sure your story is different than what they have on shelf. So walk into a store, figure out what they have on shelf, know the price points, and they're very, very familiar with that category. The buyer previously was someone who's worked on that desk for 15 years. So it's a very different buy than, say, going to Alberta or BC. Alberta, the buyers, generally speaking, work on everything. So there's generally a Bev Elk buyer or even just a wine buyer that's buying everything from Smirnoff vodka to $100 wine. Their knowledge of wine is very limited, and that type of sell is a very different sell. And what they're looking for is ensuring that one, your product's going to sell on their shelf. Two, they're going to get a good margin on because their store fronts are smaller. And three, there is a story or marketing behind that brand that they could tap into that they could then use as a flyer to ensure that people will come into their stores. So if you're going to do a marketing plan, make sure you're including them in a way that they could utilize in their own stores to ensure that they can actually activate for you kind of a store retail level.
Yeah. And what, maybe kind of following up on that a little bit more, what signals are the provincial buyers looking for when they're deciding, what deserves more than just a token presence?
I think it's definitely buyer to buyer specific. I would say one of the best ways to really get your product in is to get to know the buyers a little bit. I will say they generally speaking go to Vin Italy, for example. So that's a great way to be able to meet some buyers. Or if you get a chance to come to Ontario, definitely set up some time just to understand the kind of what they're looking for and how they want their category to move. That's number one. But number two, it'll be always price point, volume, and supply availability. Doing some market research in terms of consumer data has always been really helpful for us. So we always test our products against Canadian consumers and come in with purchase intent, understanding if the price point's right for the wine we're trying to go after. Is it a varietal that's growing in the LCBO right now? A great thing that I think Italian wines could do is I think there's a lot of trends that are happening in Europe that has not come into Canada yet. So bringing that type of research into Canada to allow some of the buyers to kind of be able to follow those trends that will come into Canada could be really interesting. I think because it's one buyer and one customer, we don't actually have the variety that a lot of other places do. So if you can bring in something different and really give the reason to why they should buy it, there's a good chance you can get that in.
And so do you think this is a good opportunity? So, Italy has so many indigenous varieties that are small, lesser known, not nearly as famous as, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Zinfandel, but is there opportunity for those wines to find? Would the Ontario consumers, the Canadian consumers be interested in discovering these smaller, but as you said, kind of growing supplies?
To basically let the LCP know, like, you will support helping consumers get to know X, Y, and Z, 100%. A great example is Lambrusco's was not a thing at the LCBO about 5 years ago, but a couple of small Italian restaurants in Ontario had started kind of selling it on the side in their own bottle shops. And so the LCBO started buying different Lambruscos just to kind of figure out different trends that are happening around that Italian wine. So there are other varietals that you think you could bring, a way to, again, allow consumers to find that wine, talk about the differences, why this versus a Pinot Grigio, or even just letting them know what a Primitivo is would be great to kind of explore the differences for Italian wines.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned Lambrusco because A, I love Lambrusco, but B, my co-host is the brand rep for Riuniti. And I feel like she's like single-handedly driving Lambrusco back into our lives and our consciousness. So she'll love that.
Love that. Honestly, it's such a good wine, and I think enough
Yes.
people ask for it that they started actually importing more. Used to be a vintage only wine, so you can only buy it once a year, and so people would go out and like buy 6 bottles at a time because you don't know if they're gonna buy it again next year. Now they have it like in the general section, which is phenomenal. So changes can happen, just takes time.
Fantastic. So what is something that maybe, any producer looking to sell in Canada, what is something that they think they know about Canada, but maybe is a misconception that actually gets in their way?
I would say we've kind of talked about it, but two things would be that all the provinces operate the same or that all the consumers operate the same. I think surprisingly to a lot of people, Canada is huge. If you were to go from Toronto to Vancouver, it's a 5, 6 hour flight. So imagine the differences in geography, in the weather that we're in the consumers that are there. Canada is a vastly very diverse place. Immigration's huge here. And so understanding that population and the differences that operate within different provinces is probably one of the biggest things.
Yeah. I think that understanding that diversity piece is huge because I'm from the US and I always thought I lived in a quote unquote melting pot until I went to Toronto and I was like, I have never seen this level of diversity anywhere in the world. Like, really, it's incredible.
It's pretty diverse, and I would say when you go to very many different places, there's always a little Chinatown, which is super fair. But if you go to Toronto, there's a little India, there's a little
Yeah.
Tibet, there's a little Japan. Like the
Wow.
diversity is sectored down, and it's just because of how vast immigration is here. I think we celebrate that quite a bit here in Canada, which is something that I think you could take advantage of if you're going to market to the place that we're going after.
Yeah, awesome. All right, let's shift over to our second takeaway because, as you mentioned, that even before the pandemic, Italian wines were the leading import wine in Canada by volume and value. And now this has only accelerated that American wines have been removed from the Canadian shelves. So hopefully you can help us to understand kind of where this gap exists in the market and how Italian suppliers can meet the needs of these consumers. So
Yeah.
first of all, kind of beyond shelf space, what emotional or identity role did American wines play for Canadian consumers? And how do you think Italy might be uniquely positioned to step in to those roles?
I'd say first, for most people who worked in the Bev Alc business, we assumed trade wars was going to happen for maybe 2 or 3 months and then it'll go back to normal. We are now, I want to say, 9 months in, and there is not really very much reprieve, and there isn't enough talks about getting that product back on shelf. There are small things that are happening in various different provinces, but it doesn't seem like it's coming back anytime soon as far as we can tell. So if you weren't taking advantage in 3 months because you were thinking maybe this is a short-term thing, we're 9 months in now. It's definitely time to take some advantages, and there are some great things you can do because it opens up shelf space 100%. In terms of consumer needs, I'd say California wine was really interesting. There's actually two spaces that they generically kind of held. One is for everyday affordable wine. So if you're thinking barefoot, brands that especially for the LDA, legal drinking age to 29, they were very much operating in that space. So what we found in both sales but also research is that Australian wines have really taken up that volume for most of that space. But we do know from previous research also for Italian wines, there's a lot of Pinot Grigios and very affordable Italian reds that capture within that same consumer segment. And so if they are willing to go out and really market at a time when there's an empty space for a lot of people who are buying that type of wine, there's a really good opportunity to capture that volume. So that's part one. And part two, I would say for the consumer needs is the premium Cab Sauv kind of red from California was huge in Canada. I think proximity to California was a big thing. A lot of people were able to kind of travel to various different vineyards to kind of try those wines. That profile was huge for a Canadian consumer. And so Italian reds have a very similar profile and they have a great ability to really capture that volume. There isn't anybody that's really capturing that volume significantly right now. And I think Italian wines can absolutely do that. So that's probably the biggest opportunity for them to really capture.
So again, just to reiterate your point, you said those kind of everyday value wines and then those like around 15 Canadian dollar red wine, bold red
Yeah.
wines. Is that what you? Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. And so then in your view, how can a supplier really avoid just simply filling the space, the empty space, and really use this as a moment to reshape the narrative around premium wine that gets imported into Canada?
I will say it is a little bit tough only because the buyers, generally speaking, for US wines and Italian wines are not the same buyer. New World and Old World buyers are generally different. And so Yes, it is a moment in time. It is a shelf space grab, and I wholeheartedly understand that. But what you can do is, if previously you were trying to fight for a space in Italian wines and that just wasn't available to you prior, there is now space on shelf for people to fill. So if you can get a space on shelf, prove out your product that you are better than a lot of other products, there will be definitely a conversation at the end of this when US wines will come back, hopefully, at one point, where then the Italian buyer is going to reevaluate what is her portfolio and what does that look like. And that's probably the best bet. So I think it's the best chance for you to launch an innovation in market. It's the time for you to test out the Canadian market, because I don't think we're ever going to get another chance where there's that much shelf space open to other import wines that wasn't available to us prior to.
So you kind of just touched on this because you said typically Canadian consumers are shopping New World versus Old World. So do you see them becoming more experimental? Do you see them becoming more or less premium? Do you see them kind of just staying more loyal to those divisions of New and Old World? Like, what is in your crystal ball? What do you see?
So, fun enough, in March when this started happening, our company actually went out and did research on tariffs. So, we knew things were going to come off shelf. We wanted to understand what would you replace it with instead of whatever could be coming off shelf. So, we did that both for bourbons, we did it for Californian wines, etc., because we do work with a lot of California suppliers. Outside of Canada, which of course everyone was at that point very much supporting Canadian products first. So Canadian wines, Canadian spirits, 100% is number one. Outside of domestic products, Italian wines were by far the number one replacement for US wines from a consumer point of view. So they also felt that that was the right replacement. And what's really interesting is we tested what's the likelihood of you moving back to US wines once it comes back. For those who would switch over to Italian wines, they felt it was only 50% of people who would switch back, versus for other categories like spirits, it was a lot higher of them coming back to a category because they felt like the replacement wasn't an exact or similar enough product for them to not want to switch back. So what's interesting about US wines is there's actually a really good chance for you to gain a loyal customer for longer than just the trade wars or the tariffs right now.
Wow. And so great that your company is able to get out there so quickly and generate all of this research. So valuable.
Absolutely. Got to really talk to your consumers, understand what they're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. So then you've touched on this a little bit, but we'll like wrap it up in a pretty bow for our listeners. What do you think is the single biggest missed opportunity for Italian wineries are overlooking right now in this California absent environment?
Okay, I would say two things. I would say California wines, historically, the brands that are doing extremely well in Canada were more lifestyle focused than kind of terroir, heritage, craftsmanship. So if you think bread and butter, if you think kind of barefoot, you're thinking brands that are creating a lifestyle around that wine. I'm sure they're beautiful wines. Consumers love that taste profile, but they've never been wines where I would come out and say like they've won awards or here's how they crafted this bread and butter cab sauv. But they've built such a strong brand recognition behind it that there isn't anybody else replacing that type of wine in market right now. So if there are Italian wines out there who's looking to build kind of a more of a lifestyle brand, I think this is your best chance to come out and do a little bit more marketing and really talk about lifestyle you can offer, especially because Italy is top of the list for most people traveling from Canada. So that's number one. And then number two is kind of more out of the box thinking. I find, and
Great.
research also backs this up, French wine and Italian wine historically has marketed more closely to craftsmanship, really talking about the quality of the wine, etc. So there's a little bit of a barrier for younger consumers to come into that category because it feels like you need to really learn about many, many things before you're deciding about a wine. Walking into the California wine section, there are definitely brands that are known for heritage, but there are also brands that are really known for fun and kind of different. So if you are willing to go out and test some out of the box formats or special different versions, labels that are a little bit different, because a lot of box wine, which is surprising, premium box wine is selling like hotcakes in Canada prior to the tariffs. So 2 liter, 4 liter boxes were huge, especially for bigger brands. And that's kind of a hole in import wine right now because import wine only sells in bag-in-a-box is what we call it, in really, really affordable everyday wine. But premium brands never wanted to kind of go into that size because they felt like the wine couldn't be preserved the same, which is super fair. But California didn't have that same perception. So a lot of brands are really willing to go out there and kind of try different formats, do different things. And so that's also an area that hasn't really been captured by anybody else.
Oh, what an interesting. So basically, what you're saying is anyone willing to be super innovative at the moment and maybe step away from kind of the way it's always been done to, I mean, the conversations that we're having all the time, right? Like how to keep wine relevant. But you actually have spaces on your shelf to open to occupy if you're willing to do this right now.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's then shift now to our third takeaway. So just talking about building long-term brand equity. So when your team is evaluating suppliers, what kind of specific, signals or behaviors tell you immediately that the winery understands how the Canadian systems actually function?
To be honest, we always assume most people are unaware just because Canada is a little bit complex, a little bit weird. So we always start with kind of a supplier 101 meeting where we sit them down. We're like, here are all the different things. And we make it mandatory for everyone to do kind of a market launch. So you go to all the major provinces, you talk to all the sales team, really understand that market by being in that market and seeing the different consumers, but also the different stores, sizes, etc.
Okay.
Things I think would help me understand that they understand the complexities would be asking as many questions as you can is probably a really big one. It's a market you're not familiar with. Don't make assumptions based on other markets. I think that's probably the two biggest things because I think Canada runs on such a regulated space. It's very, very, very different. Like a random example I can give you is I've worked on many global brands where we adapt creative across the world to Canada. Canada probably has the strictest marketing rules against beverage alcohol that I've ever seen. And so every time we create global creative, I have to put a separate brief out there to ensure that the standards can meet the ad standards here in Canada. There are small rules like if you look, it's super interesting, especially beer ads. I think it's so fun because US and Canada generally share most ads across the board, except for tiny nuances. So Canada, you cannot consume at all on any ad. So you'll see people holding beer, you'll see people cheersing beer, but there's never any consumption. And all of the drinks have to be full. So you can't have seem like you just consumed. And so
Oh,
in a lot of American ads, yeah, people drink and then the beer comes down. So in Canadian ads, we have to fill the drink back up, or we have to like
oh my
CGI the
gosh.
drink back open. Every drink has to be full as if you've never consumed a single sip. So small things like that are really interesting and ask questions because how would you know that? There's nobody else
Yeah.
in the world that markets that way. It's a really unique rule to Canada. So ask as many questions.
Wow, what an interesting call. My US focused marketing creative mind, like we're always looking on the glass not being so full, even from a moderation perspective. Like we don't want to seem like this person overindulged, but it's going to be full in Canada.
Full in Canada, cap has to be closed. There's so many random tiny little
Wow.
rules. So very interesting.
Well, if you have to keep the cap closed, I guess you're not sampling out as many bottles in creative development. So you have that going for you.
I know.
All right. So, what types then of supplier support really matter a lot more to provincial buyers than maybe producers typically realize?
I think what's interesting, and again, I'm less familiar with the rest of different countries and how they operate, is we are government run, generally speaking, across the board. And so most support programs you're hoping to purchase are purchased from the government, essentially. So a fun fact is as soon as you walk into an LCBO store, everything can be purchased. So anything you see that seems like a really fun thing that the LCBO have curated, that's probably purchased by a brand somehow. So whether that says a store manager has picked a product or an end al or gift with purchase or even cashier, there are little bottles that are on the cashier. Almost everything is purchased across the board. So it really depends on how you want to show up in a store and how you want it to be merchandised and what do you think is most helpful in making sure your product goes through. So for example, when Aperol was trying to make Aperol Spritz a huge thing in Canada, they did a giveaway between a sparkling bottle of wine and their Aperol to ensure people can drink it the way they want you to drink it. So the great thing is almost any program could be done because the government absolutely loves support programs because they get every single penny that you pay, but you have to make sure you have the dollars to support it. I would say it's probably a more expensive market to advertise in because again, it's highly regulated by the government.
Yeah, but good to know that they're open to those kinds of programs because, for example, back to the US, it's illegal for us to do any giveaway that includes alcohol. So you do have some opportunity there to actually, give away product, which is great.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you could do different things or package different things and then see how it goes. Yeah.
Well, can you think of an example? And you don't even have to name a name if you don't want to, but can you think of an example of a winery that really unlocked some disproportionate success by really mastering the mechanics? So, inventory flow, pricing cadence, in store activation.
I have a fun example, I think. I would
Okay.
say in Quebec, again, part of it is just understanding the rules and seeing if you could play within the rules. So in Quebec, for example, they have something called the Bottle in Quebec promotion. So if you are an import brand, but you want to sell your product in Quebec, one of the ways to get your leg up is you can import that wine into Quebec and bottle it in Quebec. They'll count it as import wine, but they will give you specialty treatments. You'll get a higher chance of listing because you're essentially hiring people from Quebec to help you with that. So Kim Crawford is a good example. They have their Sauv Blanc done out of Quebec. They get a listing as soon as you basically essentially are able to do that, you'd get a listing. There's a really fun brand called Wallaroo Trails, which is a really
Love it.
interesting one that we could talk about. It essentially looks, I don't know if I should say this, but it looks exactly like Yellowtail, but it is not Yellowtail, but they bottle it in Quebec. Australian wine bottled in Quebec sells extremely well. And if you bottle it in Quebec, you can then sell it in their grocery stores. And that's a great example of a brand that I would say has borrowed cues that seem similar to other brands, but have absolutely blown out of the water in Quebec. So if
Wow.
you can learn the rules and you are able to kind of operate within what the rules are offered to you, you could do some really interesting things.
Okay. Yeah. Wow. Great insight there. How would you coach some wineries to show value without having to slip into like excessive discounting? I mean, especially as you were talking about with the differences needed in the pricing structures for the provinces.
I would say that lucky or maybe unlucky for us, discounting is actually regulated here. So max the
Okay.
number of discounts you can do is 4 times essentially a year. Also, discounts are requested. So you say, I would love to do a limited time offer to the LCBO. And then the LCBO picks however many brands and which brands and what depth they're willing to give each brand. So even if you decided like every quarter I'm going to run one, you might not actually get it because it's absolutely decided by the LCBO. So I would
Okay.
say heavily discounting is not going to be a huge problem for you here in Canada. It's more about understanding cadence and maybe where your competitive set sits is what I found that was really interesting. So there are heavier seasons for various different products depending on what you sit in and where you are. You buy them by the period. So certain periods have holidays in them. So Thanksgiving is a big one. Holidays like Christmas is a huge one. And so if you're able to fall into buying a period that might serve you better, knowing that you have limited amounts of price discounts you can take, that also would be really helpful. And then again, having a great relationship with your buyers and asking them like, hey, here's my plan for the year. I'm looking for 4 LTOs. Here are the limited time offers I'm hoping to have. Are you going to support me in the brand that I'm running? Would also be really helpful because then when it comes up for the application, they're like, ah, yes, we've already talked about this. I will accept this brand over the other one.
Okay. And just for a little strategic planning call out, Thanksgiving in Canada is in October. So probably not the same period as the Christmas holiday, right?
Different periods, yes.
All right. Because for us in the US, it's basically the same, just a few weeks away. So,
Totally. Long weekends are big for, I'm sure, for Americans and also Canadians. So in the summer, every long weekend, those are all big buying holidays. People essentially stock up before they go to the cottage, etc. here. And so those are kind of moments for you to be able to capture, knowing that there's going to be a higher demand in those stores.
awesome. Another great call out. How long typically is a period for you guys? Like a buying period?
Every province is a slightly different. The one LCBO runs in this 13 period plan for a year.
Okay.
They always share out the calendar every single year on how the periods are broken down. It's about 4 weeks every single period except one.
Okay.
But every year it's like a little bit different. So I suggest if you're interested, definitely go into the LCBO website. They'll submit a calendar for you to follow every year.
All right, that's great advice. So thank you. In your experience, what really separates a winery that becomes a long-term kind of category fixture from one that might fade after a single listing cycle?
Definitely, I would say it depends on, well, I would say one, it depends on what type of listing you're looking for. So if you were looking for kind of annual one-time buys, what's great about a government regulated system is that there are very specific rules on whether you get to stay or not stay. So at the LCBO, for example, for vintages which are one-time buys, you have to have sell through the volume you have sold to the LCBO. You want to sell 80% of that within 8 weeks. So there are exact rules on how you can make sure the next year you're going to get another buy is following the rules that they've given out. So for general lists, which are kind of every day you can buy those wines, they give out what they call sales targets every single year to understand how much you have to sell. So Italian wines at the LCBO, for example, I believe the Pinot Grigio is at $1 million in value every single year you have to hit to keep your quota. So if you don't hit that quota, you'll get a warning, a delist warning is what they call it. You'll have 6 months to improve your sales. And if you get a second delist warning, then you'll get delisted. So it's never, I think it's a little bit less harsh because it's government run. You're never going to like tomorrow wake up and your product is off the shelf. You've gotten plenty of notice. You'll know exactly what you were supposed to hit. And if you're above the quota, it's never a consideration. So it's kind of dependent on you and tracking your own sales against the goals that have been set out by the government beginning of the year.
So do you see brands maybe being a little bit more conservative with the quotas that they agree to then so that they can always kind of hit above that target? Is that a strategy that you've seen or?
So if it's a general list, which is an everyday product, the LCBO sets it as a standard for everybody.
Okay.
So $1 million
Okay.
is $1 million for every Pinot Grigio that they sell. For vintage sales, 100%. If it's your first time in market, maybe don't ask for 1,000 cases because you might have a harder time selling that in 8 weeks. Start with a 200 case buy. You know you're going to 100% sell it. Prove that out. Then next year ask for 400 cases. Building up that anticipation, I actually think really works because also if a customer tries it, loves it, the next year they're going to buy a bit more knowing that that product is never going to come out. It's in a year annual cycle. So you're not going to get it for another year. You might buy 2 bottles or 4 bottles because you know you won't get it anymore. And so building up that anticipation for your customers, I think is huge in the market as well. So definitely a strategy to take.
All right. That's a great little piece of advice. So thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question before we start to wrap it up. If you could rewrite the playbook for Italian wineries when entering Canada, what would you add that most producers never think about?
I'm not sure if most producers wouldn't think about it. I think it's mostly just, I wouldn't write a playbook for Canada. I would write a playbook by province. It would be, how do you want to win in Ontario? How do you want to win in Alberta? Those are probably very, very different strategies to take, whether that's on how you promote, how you market, how you talk to the consumers are going to be very different. The size of population, size of prize. So I'd say you want to break that down and say, how do you want to win in each province? Kind of similar to, I would assume, if you're going to go into the US, you're going to say, how am I going to win in California versus how am I going to win in New York is probably very, very different. That's probably the one piece of advice I would give.
Okay, good to know. So, I mean, it sounds like in many ways this is so similar to working with the US is you don't have one strategy, you have multiple strategies and you have to understand how. And in fact, you're maybe better off because you don't have 50 provinces in Canada. How many do you have?
Ooh, with alcohol, I guess it's like we have a couple of prairies or territories at the top, but I would say the sales are very small. I'd say you have four
Yeah.
major provinces that you have to go after. So four is the core provinces. If you decide to go for secondary, in my opinion, then you have 10. You'd have 10.
All right. Very manageable.
You're manageable.
Okay, Amy, oh my gosh, you've given us so much amazing insight into Canada. I've learned so much from you. It's been really exciting to talk to you. You have like such well-rounded, practical answers to everything I asked. So thank you so much. And as we wrap up here on Masterclass, again, I'm going to call it Masterclass North American Wine Market. We close up with a rapid fire quiz where we ask our guests 3 questions to help our listeners better understand, in this case, the Canadian market. So just try to answer in, 1 to 2 sentences if you can. First, what is your number one tip for mastering the Canadian wine market?
I'd say very similar to what I said before, just understanding that the provinces are very, very different. Consumers and customers are very different. So figuring out how you want to win in each province is going to be your key takeaway.
Amazing. Amazing. Number two, what is something you would have told your younger professional self about working in the wine industry?
I think the funnest thing I've learned so far is that wine is an agriculture business. I've had the experience of strikes, port delays. I've worked on wildfires, we've worked on frost. I think know that challenge is inevitable. And so learning how to navigate through challenge is such an interesting thing when you're working in wine and something you probably did not expect. So that's probably the advice I'd give myself.
I love that answer. You forgot to mention tariffs too.
I know.
Okay, number three, we move around a lot in the wine industry. So, what is your favorite travel hack when doing market work?
I'd say always build in some time for you to kind of discover local gems, whether that's walking into a store and talking to the store staff or going to a local wine bar and talking to people there. I think you get insight from anywhere you can go, and those are the insight that you're not going to see in a report, and it's so important for you.
Yeah, great advice. That qualitative research, there is so much value in it for us to know our consumers better.
100%.
Okay, Amy, well, thank you again for taking the time to join us today. How can our listeners connect with you?
You can follow me on Instagram. I'm imported bubbly 25. That's probably your best bet, or LinkedIn for sure.
Okay, well, thank you again for taking all this time to talk to us about Canada. I know I will be seeing you very soon.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, Amy.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo!